So the title of this is Vancouver versus Hogan's Alley, Urban Renewal, Negro Removal, and the Myth of Livability. And that's in reference to the way the city sold out that part of town. And it's kind of this, for me, I think it's the pivotal story of Vancouver's history, really. It happens right there in the middle of the 20th century. And a lot changes in that moment. You get the end of NPA regime that had gone on for 30 years, and you get the rise of some of the center-left civic parties that are still around now, and a lot of those key figures. It's often spoken of as though it was this great achievement. There was this moment where Vancouver decided not to go this American route and didn't have a freeway put into it. But what people often fail to mention is that the black community, Hogan's Alley in particular, did pay the cost. There was a larger plan that was going to destroy much of the East End, including Chinatown. That did get stopped, but the viaducts were put in right where Hogan's Alley was, and that was absolutely no coincidence. That was part of a continent-wide method of basically the conversion from streetcar culture and urban culture that relied on a lot of walking and people living near where they worked, to the culture of commuting and the culture of the car, where people would live in the suburbs and drive into the city. When they started putting freeways from the suburbs to the city to make way for that shift, the decision was, where do we put a freeway? Well, do we put it through the rich part of town? Probably not. We put it through the part of town that's most easily sacrificed. And in almost every, it's really amazing. Talk to anybody from any city in this continent, and you'll get a story quite similar to this, right? A freeway run through a black community, in some cases a Chinatown, in every case a poor community. And that's the story of what happened here. Well, let's go through a little bit of it, because I'm going to speed through. The most famous surname to come out of the community, Hendricks. But for me, Jimi Hendrix is kind of the hook often for the community, because that's the international face there. But for me, that's the face that's important in the community from that family, and that's Nora Hendricks, his paternal grandmother. And I think she's really important, not just because of her connection to her grandson, but because if you look at those years, right, her life really spanned that century, and also Hogan's Alley itself, really, right? She lived right down in the East End at the beginning of it, right up through to its demise and afterwards. So was someone who participated in the creation of the church, the African Methodist Episcopal Fountain Chapel, and someone who was there, worked at Vise for a time, and was really an integral part of the community and someone important. So I often try to turn that Jimi Hendrix hook back around into a lot of the women who were important to that community. The matriarchs of the community really kept it going and define it for me. Hendrix was cool. He was only there sometimes. This is an article from the Vancouver Sun in 1952. Negroes live next door. Joyce Funka. Negroes live next door. But it was a very sympathetic article in its sort of paternalistic way. I think the last line of it is, I was reading it the other day and thinking, I wonder if it's a bright future awaits the patient Negro in Vancouver. And I felt like, and I felt like, are we at that bright future? I've been patient. So Vancouverites have 700 neighbors about whom they know very little, and that's the Crump twins right there, and their family. And that's on the. I like that photo, and I include it because I find there's a dearth of pictures of black folks in the East End that are external shots, that are kind of outside or street scenes, right? That sort of show kind of black folks on the street, and I always want those photos because it's a kind of way of countering that mantra that you always hear: there are no black folks in Vancouver, there are no black people in Vancouver. And it's like, I like showing photos like this to say, well, there they are, and you can see that it's Vancouver. There are a lot of photos, of course. Most photos that are taken are interior shots because they're taken on special occasions and things like that in people's homes. So these kind of photos are interesting, and I like to show them. What's also interesting about is the time that this article is written. So Bruce Ramsey is taking his numbers from Leonard Marsh's report that was published in 1950, which is the report that's used to launch the urban renewal schemes that are eventually going to wipe out what was Hogan's Alley. And so that's kind of a pivotal time. It's also, oddly enough, published on the very same day that the papers finally published the story of Clarence Clemens, who was a black longshoreman who was beaten to death by the Vancouver police in the East End, which became an uncomfortable cause celeb in the black community because he was a bit of a shady character, but he was beaten to death by the cops, and so it launched this, and he didn't die on the scene. He was beaten, went into a coma, and died months later. And so it kind of allowed this sort of movement to build in that time on his behalf and against police brutality. And it was actually really the beginning of the formal black activist organization in the city. A group called the Negro Citizens League was formed in response to this. I believe they were actually formed when the police were acquitted. They were kind of formed on the spot. I think the attendance at the inquest hearing for that case was reported as 80% or 90% black, if I recall. And so they showed up, faithfully attended these meetings, and then responded to it with an organized way. That's Vise. This is from a great book by Keith McKellar called Neon Eulogy. It's a wonderful write-up on Vise and a sketch of it. There are a few photographs of it around, but I really like this one because it's a nice scene. Again, it's one of those scenes of black folks, although it's from his imagination and memory. I think it's quite beautiful and a nice way to remember that place. Of course, that's a keynote in the history of the area. A little bit about the name. So a lot of people ask, there are all sorts of weird theories as to who Hogan was, and strange stories about some mythical Irishman who lived down there and stuff like that. But I think this is the real story, and it's that Hogan's Alley was an epithet. It was an insult. It was kind of like a word like ghetto or something like that from the 19th century, and it came from Richard Outcault's comic called Hogan's Alley, which, funnily enough, was making fun of the Irish. And Hogan's Alley was, in his comics, was a mythical, fictional neighborhood that he'd made up in New York. It was this chaotic area. I mean, in this, if you sort of decipher what's exactly being said here, is what they did to the dog catcher in Hogan's Alley is, well, they beat the hell out of him. But the reason behind it that's implied is that that's because they like to catch and eat dogs. And so it's this kind of weird sort of anti-Irish racism that was going on. And in that time, so that became a kind of a synonym for crazy, messed up immigrant neighborhood, where things are falling apart and everybody's going nuts, right? And that's the sort of the chaotic image there. The yellow kid is the central character there. His head is shaved because I guess they shaved their heads because lice were so common and that sort of thing. And it was the origins of the term yellow journalism was his kind of contribution to the lexicon. So there are other Hogan's Alleys. There's even a Hogan's Alley, another Hogan's Alley in British Columbia. So there's one in Rossland. It was the red light district there. And so you can find them here and there. The FBI, the training ground that they use for shooting at targets and deciding whether it's a bad guy or just a citizen is called Hogan's Alley. So that's where the name comes from. It's interesting that we've kind of reclaimed it and use it now. I mean, that memory is kind of lost. I think it's important to remember it, but another thing about the name, I guess, is that really we should probably be referring to the black community of the East End because it was beyond Hogan's Alley. That was sort of one area of it. And that's where the community seems to have begun because it was right next to the railway station, and a lot of the black men who were porters who were coming through Vancouver and doing a layover in Vancouver started to stay at a porter's quarters. There was a kind of lounge and a place they could stay without worry of being denied a place. And that was right in Hogan's Alley. And it seems like that's just before World War I, and that really seems to be the nucleus of that as a black space. And then it sort of expands from there. And as other people have said, there was a lot of other people who lived in Hogan's Alley through all the different eras, right? It was the origins of the Italian community. There were Chinese people there, Japanese there until the internment, and First Nations people as well. And that's the map of it as it used to be before the viaducts were there. So I urge you, as we enter into a civic election pretty soon, Vision Vancouver has some ideas about getting rid of those viaducts. Whatever they do, I think it's essential that there's some kind of memorial there to remember that that was Hogan's Alley, and it was targeted to put those viaducts in, so that history should be cited at that place, I think. So when those debates pop up, and they're coming, participate in them if you can, and try to make that point. This is a city that continually tries to forget that it has black people in it. This would be a way to counter that. This is it now, between the viaducts. And some of my own, that wasn't my shot, the last one, but this one is. Things are rapidly changing. I took these a few years ago, and it's a little different even now, right? They're developing that lot that's on that side. And these houses, I think, are fascinating. Just because if you look at them, right, so these are new houses, and they built them to look like old houses. And Leonard Marsh and the city of Vancouver's, their sort of excuse for targeting Hogan's Alley for renewal, which really meant destruction, was that the houses were old and blighted. And so there's this terrible irony that you get, 40 years later, 30 years later, 40 years later, the building houses that resemble these old would have now become character homes. And in that period and in that literature were called blighted and were targeted for demolition for that reason. So it's a terrible irony. And that shot you see in the back, the McLean Park project. So that was a tower block that they built that the people who were going to be displaced in Hogan's Alley were meant to move into. Right? That's where they're supposed to end up. It's this exact same plan. They built the infamous projects in cities across the United States, right? So the projects are infamous for that. Well, the project was to do this, right? And they did it in Vancouver too. The black community didn't end up moving into those tower blocks. There was also the Rainier one. But and that's well, I'll leave it to you to read why I think that didn't happen. But it didn't happen, and I have a few theories on why exactly that is. But basically, it's the moment where the black community of Vancouver integrated. And so, so I think that's time.